There's a moment in every industry when someone quietly does something that changes everything. Not with a parade, not with a countdown, just a simple announcement that lands like a stone dropped into still water. This was that moment. The CEO of Mercedes stood up and confirmed what insiders had whispered about for years. The YASA Flux engine is real, it exists, and it's coming. No one in that room fully understood what that meant yet, but they were about to, because this isn't a story about a car engine. This is a story about a decade-long secret, a small British startup that almost nobody had heard of, and a single acquisition that may have just redrawn the entire map of the automobile industry. And once you understand what Mercedes actually built and why they built it the way they did, you'll never look at an electric car the same way again. But before we get there, we need to go back, because what happened in that press conference was not the beginning of this story. It was just the first time the public was allowed to see it. Somewhere between 2010 and 2015, while the world was falling in love with Tesla, Mercedes was watching, carefully, quietly, without saying much at all. Tesla had done something remarkable. They had taken a technology most people associated with golf carts and made it aspirational. Suddenly, electric cars weren't just practical, they were desirable, they were fast, they were status symbols, and the entire auto industry had to reckon with that. Most companies responded the way big companies usually do. They announced plans, they made promises, they formed committees. Mercedes did something different. They started asking a question that nobody else was really asking at the time. Not how do we build a better battery, not how do we compete with Tesla's software. Those were the obvious questions. Every company in the world was chasing those. Mercedes asked, what if the motor itself is the problem? Because here's something most people don't know about electric cars. The battery gets all the attention. The range, the charging time, the cost per kilowatt, that's what fills the headlines. But sitting quietly inside every EV, doing the actual work of turning electricity into movement, is the motor. And for decades, that motor hadn't really changed. Not fundamentally, not at the level of its core design. Everyone had accepted it. Mercedes decided not to. In 2019, Mercedes made a purchase that barely registered in the financial press. They acquired a small British engineering company called YASA. Most people who heard about it assumed it was a routine talent acquisition, a way to bring some smart engineers in-house. It wasn't. YASA had been quietly developing something called an axial flux motor, and the reason almost no one was talking about it was that it existed mostly in research papers and early-stage prototypes. It was the kind of technology that engineers got excited about and executives were skeptical of. Too complex to manufacture, too expensive to scale, theoretically brilliant, practically difficult. Mercedes looked at all of that and said, we'll take it. They didn't announce what they were planning to do with it. They didn't hold a press conference. They moved YASA's team inside their own research infrastructure, gave them funding, gave them time, and told the world essentially nothing. And this is where the story starts to get uncomfortable, because while Tesla was launching product after product, while BYD was scaling to become the largest EV manufacturer on the planet, while Toyota was betting the house on hydrogen, Mercedes was in a room somewhere, working on something none of them were working on, and they weren't in a hurry. That patience is either the smartest thing they've ever done, or it cost them years they can't get back. By the end of this, you'll have to decide which one you believe, to understand why the YASA Flux engine matters. You need to understand what's wrong with the motors inside most electric cars today. Picture a cylinder. That's the basic shape of a traditional electric motor, what engineers call a radial flux design. Magnets and copper coils are arranged around the outside of that cylinder, and when electricity runs through them, the cylinder spins. It works. It has worked for over 100 years. But it has a problem. It's inefficient in a specific and costly way. As that motor runs, it generates heat, a lot of it, and that heat is wasted energy. Electricity that came from your battery traveled through your motor and instead of moving your car forward, simply disappeared into the air as warmth. The more you push the motor, the worse this gets. And because the motor is running constantly, even that slow, steady leak of energy adds up over the course of a drive. Instead of a cylinder, picture a disc, flat, thin, like a plate. That's the axial flux design. The magnets and coils are arranged differently, facing each other across a narrow gap rather than wrapped around a cylinder. And because of that geometry, the physics of energy transfer changes. Less heat, less waste. More of the electricity from your battery actually becomes motion. If you're driving a car, today, with a 400-kilometer range, the same battery paired with an axial flux motor could take you 500 kilometers, maybe 550. Not because the battery got bigger, not because the chemistry changed, because less energy disappeared before it could do its job. That's not a small improvement. In the EV market, range is everything. Range is the number that appears in every advertisement that gets compared in every review. That determines whether someone drives home confident or anxious. Adding 100 to 150 kilometers to a vehicle's range without touching the battery is the kind of result that changes buying decisions at scale, but efficiency is only half of it. The other half is what axial flux does to the motor itself, because the disc design is so much more compact than a cylinder. The motor can be dramatically smaller and lighter while producing the same or greater power output. We're talking about a motor that might weigh 60 to 70 kilograms, doing the work of one that previously weighed 100. And when you reduce the weight of the motor, you reduce the overall weight of the vehicle. And when you reduce the weight of the vehicle, every other system on that car starts performing better. The battery works less hard, the brakes last longer, the handling sharpens. There's also torque. Torque is the force that gets a car moving. The twist that pushes you back in your seat when you press the accelerator. Traditional electric motors build torque progressively. The YASA Flux engine delivers it immediately. Full force, from a standstill, the moment your foot moves. On paper, that sounds like a racing statistic. In practice, it's the thing that makes a car feel alive. It's the quality that turns driving from transportation into experience. And it's one of the reasons people pay premiums for performance vehicles. Mercedes didn't build this engine to win a spec sheet comparison. They built it to change what driving feels like. Now here is where the dominoes start falling, and they fall in a direction that nobody in the industry was fully prepared for. Tesla built its dominance on two things: software and battery management. Their motors were good, powerful, reliable, proven, but they were not revolutionary. They were radial flux motors, the same fundamental design that has existed for decades, refined and optimized to a very high level. Tesla's genius was never really the motor. It was everything around it. But the axial flux engine doesn't compete with Tesla's software. It doesn't compete with their autopilot or their over-the-air updates or their supercharger network. It competes with the one component Tesla never really had to defend, because no one had ever seriously challenged it. The motor. If Mercedes can deliver meaningfully more range, meaningfully faster response, and meaningfully better efficiency from the same battery, then the comparison between a Tesla and a Mercedes EV changes, not in software, not in brand perception, in the fundamental physics of the vehicle. And that's a harder gap to close with a firmware update. BYD faces a different problem. Their rise was built on battery innovation. The Blade battery was genuinely impressive, safer and more durable than most competitors. But a better battery paired with an outdated motor is like a more powerful fuel tank in a car with a leaking engine. The YASA Flux engine doesn't attack BYD's battery. It makes the motor the new battlefield. And BYD isn't prepared for that fight in the same way. Toyota is perhaps the most interesting case. They placed a long, expensive bet on hydrogen fuel cells as the future of clean transportation. That bet looked reasonable 5 years ago. It looks increasingly isolated now. If Mercedes succeeds in making axial flux motors the new standard for EVs, cheaper to run, longer range, lighter vehicles, then the argument for hydrogen in passenger cars becomes harder to make. Not impossible, but harder. 3 different vulnerabilities. 1 engine dot. But here is the part of this story that doesn't get discussed enough, because everything described so far sounds like an inevitable march toward a better future. And the auto industry's history is littered with technologies that sounded exactly like that. The manufacturing reality of the YASA Flux engine is genuinely unsolved at scale. Building one axial flux motor in a laboratory is a precision achievement. Building 100,000 of them consistently, affordably, without defects, inside the kind of supply chain that a global automaker depends on, That is a completely different problem. The tolerances required for the disk geometry are extremely tight. The magnets involved, neodymium primarily, are rare earth materials.